Welcome to Politics Now, where we interview newsmakers, and we have today, welcoming back to Politics Now, the Speaker of the Assembly, Jason Frierson. Thanks for being here. I appreciate it.
No, good to be back.
So, how do you think things are going to be different with a supermajority in the Assembly and almost, but not quite, a supermajority in the Senate?
Well, you know, I don't think that a supermajority relieves us of our obligation to be statesmen, to be responsible with the influence that we have. And so, I think that we will work hard, work together both with both houses and the executive, and with the minority party to move Nevada forward. And that's been our agenda from the entire interim, and we'll continue to do that through session.
Yeah, this is, if I'm not mistaken, this is the first time since you've been a lawmaker that there's been a Democratic governor.
It is. It's the first time since I have been on this side of the aisle we've had a Democratic governor. But of course, I had a great relationship with Governor Sandoval, and I also have a great relationship with Governor Sisolak. He was my commissioner, so I'm looking forward to working with him. And I think we have a lot of shared priorities, and we're going to try to move Nevada forward.
In terms of the historic, first, we have a female majority of lawmakers. There's been female speakers, there's been female lieutenant governors, but this is the first time women make up a majority of the legislature. How do you think that's going to be different in terms of what bills come out?
Well, you know, we have worked hard to recruit a legislature and an assembly in particular that reflects the state. So I'm proud to be a part of that. My majority leader is female and a very strong leader. My chair of Ways and Means is female and a very strong leader. These are values that we've carried throughout my involvement. But, you know, let's keep in mind, I was recruited by the first female speaker of the State Assembly. So these are values that we've already had, and what a wonderful opportunity to have them actually at the table, to have, you know, to take part in the discussions and have that kind of influence directly at the table.
One of the members of the female majority told me for a separate interview that you know, women experience things differently, and as a result of that, the priorities that they might have might otherwise not be recognized or reflected, and now that they have a majority, that those for sure will be recognized. Do you think there's any truth to that, or do you think that even when women weren't a majority, that their concerns and their needs were recognized by the legislature?
Well, I think their perspective is always valued, and they always bring a unique approach and a unique experience. So I would agree. Not always are women's views being advocated for as strongly when they're not at the table. We've tried to do a good job. I think one of the best things that I can do as leader is recognize I know enough to know I don't know enough, and I need some of my colleagues at the table with me. I think last session is a wonderful example where we expanded the protections against sexual harassment, brought in both visitors to the building and the lobby corps, and it's important that we had women at the table to talk about those issues and help develop a process so that we were appropriate and thinking about things that we as men wouldn't ordinarily think of.
Now, I don't know if you know this, but you developed quite a reputation during your first time around as Speaker as somebody who is sober, who is fair-minded, who's willing to work with the other side. I don't know how you think you're going to have a future in politics with that kind of a rep. I really don't. But there's a lot of conservative critics who said, oh, well, the Democrats are in charge now. They've got both houses of the legislature. They've got the governor. We're going to become California overnight. What do you say to that?
I spent 10 years in northern Nevada, and I've spent twice as long down here in southern Nevada. I love this state. We have advocated for Nevada, not California, not any other state. I think the concerns that some folks have are concerns that don't take into account what we did last session. We had opportunities to advance policies that some folks thought was too far, and we killed those, and we stopped those. We had discussions, but we managed to lead in a way that's consistent with Nevada, and I have no intention of doing anything different this upcoming session.
Yeah, the importance of this session is really not only for what you're going to do in 2019, but also for what's going to happen in 2020. And that is because whoever gets elected in 2020, whoever has the majority, will be the party that is writing the new redistricting plan. There's already a Democratic governor. If Democrats take the majority, they will be the ones writing the plan. And unlike last time, a veto is probably unlikely. It'll probably be the plan that goes into effect. How much of that is overshadowing what you're going to do?
Well, I think that we have to be responsible. We listened to voters at the door this last cycle, and I think the election reflected that we were in tune with what voters were saying at the doors. I think we have to continue to connect with voters as we explore redistricting. We don't want to risk a veto. We also don't want to risk being caught up in court. So we're going to have to be leaders and be responsible with setting boundaries that continue to reflect the actual Nevada population and Nevada values. And so long as we're being responsible with it, I think we'll do a good job and we'll avoid litigation and move this state forward consistent with the population.
Now, you mentioned at the very beginning not only working with the executive, but working with the other side. Now, in Nevada, the minority party has virtually no power. And they really can't do anything to advance their agenda. The only way they can really have a voice is by cooperation. Right. Do you anticipate that that's going to happen?
Well, I can't speak for them. I extended an olive branch last session with 25 members in the majority to the minority leader to say, if you want to be at the table, I welcome it, and let's have some bipartisan legislation moving forward. And we were successful on a certain level. I think a majority of the legislation that we had some level of bipartisan support. I extend the same offer to members of the minority caucus this cycle. My intention is, even though we have a quote-unquote supermajority, to move Nevada forward in a bipartisan and cooperative way to the extent that we can. I hope that we don't get caught up in national rhetoric, and I welcome their seat at the table.
Many people probably be surprised to find that most of the legislation the legislature passes with fairly large majorities, both parties.
Right.
There are some bills that pass on party line votes, but the rule generally is that there's cooperation. I asked your counterpart in the Senate, Kelvin Atkinson, this. I'll ask you the same question. Are you frustrated that there isn't a supermajority in both houses, or are you relieved that there's not a supermajority in both houses?
Well, I think that I would have been able to manage in the same style regardless. We do have a supermajority in the Assembly, so I'm going to govern the way that I governed and led before, and that is in an inclusive manner. I think that Majority Leader Atkinson is going to do the same. We have great relationships across the aisle, so I'm confident that we'll have a process that our Nevadans can be proud of. We reject the national rhetoric coming out of D.C., so I think that the only way for us to move forward in a lasting way is to try to do it together. Yeah,
and by the national rhetoric, you're talking about the fact that you could, if you wanted to, pass every bill you wanted without any regard to the other side, without any regard even to whether or not the governor would sign it. Right. But you're talking about that's not what you want to do.
Well, that's not leadership. Leadership is hard. I think being collaborative is hard. Including the minority party when you don't even have to is hard. But us being in the supermajority does not relieve us of the obligation to be responsible with the power that we have right now. And I think we have to think about the long-term history of the state and what we've done up till now. Our former leaders, Joe Dini and Bill Raggio, were folks that I watched coming up, and I think those are leaders that set a standard that we can continue to have moving forward. But we have to be responsible with it, and we have to be as inclusive as we can. I think that's what Nevadans want.
In terms of the top priorities, what would you say if you were to list the Democratic agenda? What are the top priorities for the legislature that you're going to focus on?
Sure. I mean, I think public education remains a priority. I put out a plan early last year, and I believe it was in July, in the summer of last year, talking about making public education a priority and setting forth some ideas of some things that we need to do. I think healthcare, expanding healthcare, is also going to be a priority of ours. Either expanding it or at the very least making it more affordable for everyday Nevadans. Those are two big priorities. For me, and it's always been a priority of mine, is to make sure that we maintain a culture of statesman-like behavior in the legislative process. I think we need to lead and show the country that Nevada has a free spirit, and I think that a way of being united, especially after last year, that a lot of other states haven't been able to show. So I think we'll continue to do that. Of course, renewable energy is always going to be a priority of ours, so we're going to have to focus on that. Criminal and social justice reform is something that we are going to also have to make a priority, but we're going to do it together.
Yeah. In terms of education, let's talk about a couple of those priorities. Do you think there's any chance that the legislature will need to consider a tax increase to fund public education, either reforms, new programs, or the existing programs?
Well, I, as a leader, always believe that we need to look at the resources that we have first. So before we start talking about taxes, we need to look at what we have and make sure that we're being responsible with the resources that we have. In 2015, we passed the commerce tax. I wasn't there, but the legislature passed the commerce tax, and I think what our community needs is predictability and stability. So first we look at our own house, and we look at how we are spending the resources that we have, and then we explore options. But that's what a 120-day process is for. So we sit down at the table with our stakeholders and community partners and talk about how best to meet the needs of our kids.
Yeah, so you wouldn't absolutely rule it out, but you wouldn't also say, yeah, we're going to definitely do it.
Well, I don't know that it's time to have that conversation about taxes before we talk about how we're using the resources that we have.
Yeah, okay. Do you think there's any chance that the Education Savings Account program will be funded? There's a BDR to do so. Do you think there's any chance that that'll happen?
That's a non-starter for my members.
Okay, so that's a definite no there. The Read by 3 program, there's a lot of people who say, look, we're going to need to reform this because there's a large number of students who would have to be held back under that law, and we just don't have the teachers, we don't have the space to deal with that. Do you think that program will get tinkered with over the course of the session?
Well, I think we always have to look in the mirror and consider adjustments. So I think the Read by 3 program is well intended, and I think we need to focus on making sure that our kids are prepared as they age out of the system to go into high school, to middle school and high school. So we'll certainly be open to any adjustments that I think increase effectiveness.
Yeah, because that, I mean, a lot of people say, look, that's a no-brainer. Kids should be able to read by 3. That's a minimum expectation we ought to have.
Right.
And so, you know, any kind of reforms to it that take away from that would probably be a bad idea.
Well, I think it would be a bad idea, but I also think that we need to give teachers the tools they need to be able to do it. And until we give teachers the tools they need to do their job effectively, it's difficult to put increasing burdens on them. And so we can't have that conversation about the structure of our education system without also talking about giving the teachers the tools they need. Sure,
that makes sense. I mean, you can't tell a guy to build a house if you don't hand him a hammer.
Right.
Yeah, I get it. In the healthcare arena, Assemblyman Mike Sprinkle had a bill last time that would allow anybody, regardless of age or medical condition, to buy into the Medicare program, provided they paid the full cost. So the state wouldn't be subsidizing them. Do you think that plan has a chance?
Well, I think we have to look at providing affordable health care to Nevadans. I think we have several options on the table, including Assemblyman Sprinkle's bill. We also have to look at balanced billing, the surprise billing issue in health care and emergency rooms in particular. I think we are going to continue to look at the cost of pharmaceuticals. But at the end of the day, we need to have everything on the table to talk about how we can make healthcare affordable. Assemblyman Sprinkle's bill is an option. I know that there's an option coming out of the Senate as well that was discussed during the interim. So we need to have these conversations, but as a citizens legislature, we need to have those with the stakeholders at the table so we can get as much input as we can about what best way to move forward.
Yeah, because you also have to look at the impacts on the system overall for the existing patients that are in that system who qualify now under that as before adding new ones.
Right, exactly. We have to make sure it's financially stable in order to sustain that kind of expansion.
Yeah. Do you think the elimination of the penalty for not having insurance that the Republicans did in one of their attempts to repeal the Affordable Care Act, is that going to have an impact on the state's Medicaid program?
Well, I think so. I think anytime you're talking about less resources going into the system, you're going to have to make some adjustments and recognize you're going to have less support and infrastructure. So I think it's certainly going to impact us, you know, on a state level, and we're going to continue to advocate for a more stable form of health care nationally with our national partners.
Yeah. In the when it comes to energy, in the last election, voters approved by a 60% majority a RPS that would basically say the state has to buy 50% of its energy from renewable sources by the year 2030. Right. Now that's a constitutional amendment. It's going to be on the ballot again in 2020. But there's a lot of people who are saying, well, look, it seems like it's got a lot of support. Why not pass it in the legislature in 2019 and start on the path early?
I would certainly like to pass it. We passed a measure similar last legislative session at 40%, and unfortunately that bill was vetoed. So the people have spoken and they support 50%. So we'll certainly have that conversation.
Yeah. Speaking of vetoes, there were a number of bills that were vetoed by the governor. He has never had a veto overridden.
Right.
He's out of office now. Do you think, you know, you have more than 2/3 in the Assembly and almost that in the Senate. Do you think that any of those vetoes will be overridden, or do you think that the legislature will just start fresh and it may be easier to pass some of those bills anew than overriding his veto?
I don't think that there's a need to override a veto when we are in charge of both the House and the Senate and the executive. I think this simply gives us more time to look at those issues. We can certainly look at the veto messages and maybe make some adjustments to take those concerns into account, but there's no rush. We have time, we have a whole session, and this gives us an opportunity to fine-tune any of those bills and move forward. I think overriding vetoes at the outset of session is just setting the bad tone, especially when we don't have to.
Yeah, so Governor Sandoval will have a perfect record when it comes to veto being overridden.
Well, I'm no historian in this regard. I kind of don't like to look at vetoes and certainly overrides, but I don't think the vetoes are overridden very frequently in Nevada, and I think that we should be thoughtful and mindful about the concerns and take advantage of the opportunity to make necessary adjustments.
One issue that has been very controversial is the background check issue. A bill was passed, it was vetoed by the governor, an initiative was passed. It had a technical flaw, it couldn't go into effect. But the idea that every gun sale should be subject to a background check, including between private parties, is one that the voters, at least a bare majority of, approved in 2016, I think it was.
Right.
So should that bill pass? Do you think that bill has a good chance of passing?
I think that bill has an excellent chance of passing. I think that we need to find a way to support expanding background checks, and I think it's going to create a safer community, a safer state, without infringing on folks' Second Amendment rights.
Yeah, okay. Finally, last question. There was a bill in 2017 that would have installed cameras in special needs classrooms in the Clark County School District. That bill went through a lot of machinations in the Senate. It never came to the Assembly and ultimately was not passed. Recently, our I-Team has done a lot of stories about abuse of autistic children in special needs classrooms. Do you think that bill has a chance of passing in the 2019 session?
I'm unfamiliar with the bill itself, considering it never got to the Assembly. Yeah. But keep in mind, my background for the last several years has been working with abused and neglected children. I think that we have to do everything that we can to protect vulnerable communities and in particular children in our system. So I'm committed to finding ways. Cameras may be the way. I think that we also have to do a better job of screening the people that we have teaching our kids. Sure. I think everything needs to be on the table to make sure we protect our kids, not just our autistic kids, but all of our children. I know that school security has been an issue for Governor Sisolak. It was a concern for Governor Sandoval, and he put it in his budget. So I think that we're going to have to look at every opportunity we have to make sure we keep kids safe, whether they're autistic or not. Yeah. And I think that those things need to be on the table. But I'd look forward to the discussion, and if that bill gets out of the Senate, we'll certainly take a look at it. Yeah,
but particularly with reference to autistic children who may not be able to articulate, right, you know, what happened to them. Do you think, just as a general principle, that the idea of cameras in there would be a good idea so that there can be some accountability in that case?
I think cameras are an option for accountability. I think we could also have teachers' aides. I mean, there are lots of opportunities that we have. I'd look forward to having a conversation and looking at that piece of legislation again. It never got out of the Senate, so I wasn't able to take a look at it to see what held it up, but I'd certainly be willing to look at that and consider all options.
You're certainly not opposed to putting cameras in those classrooms?
I'm not opposed to it. I think that we have to talk to the professionals that teach those kids and rely on them to give us advice about what's most conducive for a healthy classroom environment, but also a safe classroom environment.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for taking the time to come down and talk to us. I'm sure we'll have you on before the end of the session to talk more about some of these issues.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Great.